Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master. And as of me recording this, yesterday was Father's Day, and I had the most insane day ever. It was one of the best days of my life. I spent the entire afternoon hanging out with Spider Man and Dr. Octopus from Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, Duke and Beachhead from G.I. Joe, Cyclops and Colossus from Pride of the X-Men, Bruce Banner and She-Hulk from the Hulk, Lance and Sven from Voltron, Batman from Tiny Toons, Grouchy, Handy, and Lazy from the Smurfs. I mean, the list just goes on and on. But so I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning of all of this and start there, right? So this past weekend, there was a convention in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And Friday was the first day of the con. So on Friday night, I heard it was very busy. Then on Saturday, all day long, it was busy, but not too busy, right? It was like steady. But then after that, most of the con goers went home. So when my family and I arrived at the convention hall, it was lunchtime on Sunday, and the place was a ghost town. We bought our tickets at the door, and the girl putting the thing around the wrist to prove that you paid, I asked her, where are the celebrities? And she said they were in the far corner. Now, mind you, I knew I was going to this con for a couple of weeks in advance. And every convention I've been to had a line of people waiting to meet each celebrity. And you usually have people behind you that are waiting on their turn, right? So going into this, I only had a few seconds worth of questions prepared. So imagine my surprise when we get there and we are the only convention goers there, right? No lines. And that wasn't just because it was lunchtime. I stayed until they closed their doors that evening, and I never saw a line anywhere. And when you spoke to a celebrity, you literally had all day long, right? You had all the time in the world. So, so when we walked in, all of the celebrities had gone to lunch except for Michael Bell. And some of you know exactly who that is, right? But for those of you who are unfamiliar, Michael Bell is perhaps best remembered as the voice of Duke on the original G.I. Joe cartoon. And he was also on Transformers, where he played a ton of different characters, one of whom was a police car named Prowl. And for those that know me pretty well, you may know that back in the mid 90s, in real life, I bought a car that was the same make and model as Prowl. And then I took it to Mako along with my Prowl toy from the 80s, and I asked them to paint my car to look like that toy, and they did. And to this day, if you go to Google and you do an image search for G1 Prowl Real or G1 Prowl Auction, you're probably going to see a photograph of me in the driveway of my childhood home. So, back when Facebook first became a thing around 2009 or so, those photos of me with my car were making the rounds. And someone posted one on Michael Bell's Facebook page, asking him if he'd ever seen them. Then a mutual friend tagged me in the photo, So I entered the conversation then and I spoke to Michael briefly, but not really too much, right? So when I walked up to his table, I showed him those photos of the Prowl car in real life on a cell phone. And he smiled and he said he remembered me. So I shook his hand and I gushed for a little bit, saying what a big fan I was of G.I. Joe and stuff like that. And he was extremely warm and kind. And then I introduced my son, who shook his hand and said something about GI Joe. So Michael did the Duke voice and said "Yo Joe" to my son. That was awesome. I introduced my wife, and she said that her dad had been in the army, so she'd grown up on GI Joe and grown up on army bases and stuff like that. And then I introduced my daughter, and so she had been on a car ride to get here for 2.5 hours, right? And my son, to entertain himself, was kind of poking at her and being an instigator. So my daughter was like in kind of a bad mood, you know what I mean? And I don't know if she quite realized who Michael Bell was. So I start pointing out on his tables all this artwork that he has where he signs a drawing of Prowl or a drawing of Duke or whatever, you know. He signs this art and then he sells it. And so I start pointing out stuff that I think that she would like more than others or things that she is more familiar with. And she's a big fan of Voltron. So I said, "Hey, he was Lance, pilot of the Red Lion, and he was Sven, the original pilot of the Blue Lion, you know." And so she started to kind of like her mood got a little better. You know what I mean? And then I mentioned because she was a big fan of the Smurfs. So I said, hey, look at this. He's the voice of Hefty Smurf and Grouchy Smurf and Lazy Smurf. Um, and then I saw this picture he had of Swoop. And for those that don't know, Swoop is from Transformers. He's a robot who can transform into a pterodactyl. And when my daughter was a baby, I would have her on my lap while I was watching the Transformers DVDs, right? And I'd watch them like all the time. And fast forward a couple years to when she's like 3 years old or something, and she loved Swoop. That was the one character that she like really latched onto for some reason, right? And you know how some kids at that age they have like a blanket or a teddy bear that they take with them anywhere. Well, so my daughter would always steal my Swoop toy and she'd carry that around with her. So I told him this. So he asks what her name is, and she says it's Barbara. So without missing a beat, Michael Bell goes into the Swoop voice and he says, "Swoop, love Barbara." And she went from being in a bad mood, right? And being like kind of apathetic. Like she looks at me and I just see the tears form in her eyes and her lower lip like quivers. And it was like this core memory was unlocked or something, right? And she just starts to sob, and she looks at me and she's like, "Dad, it's Swoop." And so he talked to her some more in the Swoop voice, saying, Swoop wants to be your friend or something along those lines, right? And she's just crying these tears of joy. And by the way, I think there's something to that, I've been in that situation and it's I think everybody has it in them. It's just a question of whether or not you encounter the thing that like unlocks that deep inside of you, right? And so at any rate, he brought that out of her. And then she's crying and so I said, "Is it okay if she hugs you?" And he's like, "Absolutely." So she walked around behind his table and he gave her a hug that was like a 5 minute long hug or something. And I wish now that we had taken a photo of that and we didn't. We were just so in the moment and we were so moved, by all of that. We didn't even think about grabbing a photo. But we stood there for I don't even know how long just talking to Michael Bell. And I was telling him about he said something about them killing off Prowl and Transformers the movie. I made a joke about how someone broke the headlight on my Prowl car, and um I said it was that same headlight, and he kind of laughed. He's like, "Yeah, that's what killed me. They shot me in my headlight." And I said, "Well, here's the good news is I fixed it." So I was like, "So Prowl's not dead." And he laughed and he's like, "All right." Like he fist bumped me. So that was really neat. But yeah, we just stood around talking to him like forever. And then after a while, Flint Dilly came back from lunch. And like I've mentioned in some other episodes of my podcast, Flint and I are friends, right? But we mostly talk over Facebook. And on Facebook, I rarely ever use a photograph of myself. I always have a profile picture that's like Optimus Prime or Superman or something like that, right? So Flint's looking at me, but he can't quite figure out where he knows me from, right? So I shake his hand and I tell him my name, and he gets up all of a sudden. He grabs me by both shoulders and he's like, "Chris, oh my gosh, I didn't know you were going to be here today." And by the way, the image I'm using for today's episode, the photograph, was taken of me and Flint. I'm the bald one. It was taken about 30 seconds after this moment that I'm describing. So he still kind of has that look on his face. Anyways, so he tells me to pull up a chair. And I said, I don't want to intrude or anything like that. And he's like, "No, man, hang out. Like, it's awesome to finally meet you face to face." So, yeah, that was great. And so I ended up sitting at his table all day long. And we talked about anything and everything from Jimmy Stewart in Five Goes West, which he wrote, and Steven Spielberg directed it. And he was telling me how he was sitting as close to Spielberg as he was to me. And, this is what Spielberg is like, and da 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 da. We talked about like Bigfoot and like urban legends like the Mothman and stuff like that, and how he was using stuff like that and this one story he was writing, and like so that was cool. And my family just got a huge kick out of all of that, right? Because they'd heard me mention Flint here and there over the years, but it sort of hit different for them to see me invited behind the table and for the duration of the whole show, you know what I mean? So they thought that was cool. And so then as I'm sitting there, Flint now is on my right, and now to my immediate left is Michael Bell. So when Flint would have a rare fan, didn't happen often, but when a fan would come up and ask Flint a question about something, then I'd turn the other way and I'd be talking to Michael Bell, who didn't have anybody at the time. And then me and Michael Bell would talk about anything and everything. And I think I started to say this earlier and I didn't finish it. He had this interesting thing about Bambi, where he said he was 86 years old. And so just as Transformers the movie, like I told him I remembered seeing the movie in the theater, and I remembered before we saw the movie, all the kids were in the lobby hyperactive, basically. And then we saw it, and then when we were leaving the movie theater, everybody was like not hyper. Like everybody was sad. And he said, I think it's your Bambi. And that kind of took me off guard. And he said when he was a little kid, he saw Bambi in the movie theater. And when Bambi's mom dies, all the kids go quiet. And and then he started doing the lines from Bambi and doing his take on the Bambi voice, which was super interesting because that's, he was not in that, but he was just like performing it for me. And it was like really emotional. And I was like, wow, okay. And Bambi's not my cup of tea, but it clearly had an effect on him, you know? But so yeah, he was talking about that. And then something else that was interesting was because he's been in a lot of shows like say robotics where he'd be the voice of a certain character and maybe he doesn't even remember doing it because to him that was kind of just a job and he doesn't have people coming up asking for whatever that autograph or to sign robotics DVDs or whatever, you know what I mean? So he didn't know as much about that kind of thing and then he was asking me. And that was like kind of surreal to have him be like, I was on a show called Robotics, and yeah. And like then I had to like tell him what it was about, stuff like that. Or there are these other moments where um he would have some question or something about like the continuity of the stuff that he did do that maybe he didn't know as much about. Like for instance, with Prowl dying in Transformers the movie, I was familiar with something called the Genetronic Translink system, which is from the Japanese comics, and it's how they brought Prowl back to life, basically. And he'd never heard that. So he was hearing that from me for the first time. Or there was this other moment, it was kind of weird, where there was a show called G.I. Joe Renegades. And it was not a sequel to the 80s G.I. Joe. It was a reboot, right? So it was a new continuity where they were starting over from scratch. But there was an episode where you meet Duke's dad. So they called in Michael Bell to be the voice of Duke's dad. And I don't know what happened on his end. Um, but he was confused and he thought he was Duke in that. And he thought it was a sequel to the original. But we talked about that for a little bit. And it was kind of sad in a way because he thought that Duke had a happy ending. He thought that Duke married Scarlet and that they had a kid who enlisted and that they gave the kid his dad's old code name. So he thought the kid was basically Duke too, right? And I knew that was not actually the case. Um, but I really didn't have the heart to tell him because it seemed to make him happy. This idea that, and mind you, it's not like he's totally wrong. There are a ton of people who love these actors, and that I watched the show as a kid, and like I mentioned to him, I said, I'm I'm older now than he was when he did the show. And I still love the show. Um, and that meant a lot to him. I could tell that he likes that he did something that made people happy and that is beloved and cherished and you know what I mean? Um, but part of it was some of these things that he did, he thought it was kind of like continuity in that the show is still going after all these years, and I just shut up. I thought like, you could tell him it's a reboot. I mean, for that matter, I don't know if he knows what a reboot is, you know? Um, but I thought you could say something, but like, what would you be doing? Making him sad, maybe? Like, no way I'm gonna do that. So yeah, I just shut up. But there were a lot of moments like that. That was interesting. Um, and then because it was Father's Day, his daughter Ashley was there too, and she was really nice. She is also an actress. She was in the last Exorcism movie, as well as The Walking Dead, and her mom was She-Hulk in the old cartoon. So that was really cool too, you know. And anyway, so as I'm sitting there talking with these guys, Michael and Flint, Dan Gilvezan gets back from lunch. And for those who don't know, Dan, he was the voice of Spider-Man on a cartoon when I was a kid called Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. And I actually got signed art of those characters thanks to my daughter. So Frank Welker signed Iceman, Kathy Garver signed Firestar, and Dan Gilvezan then signed Spider-Man. Um, and then I also got both Dan and Michael to sign the GM screen for DC Heroes. But again, I'm getting kind of excited and I'm getting ahead of myself. So I guess where we were at in the story is that so Dan gets back from lunch, and my wife is a huge fan of Bumblebee. So she goes over to Dan's table, and I had bought her not too awful long ago a Bumblebee action figure that actually transforms into a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. And by the way, in real life, back around 2010, I bought her an actual new Beetle, right? And we got a big, like a 1 foot by 1 foot Autobot sticker, and we put it on the hood of the car then, where that goes. So she goes over to Dan's table and she shows her the yellow Volkswagen on her phone, you know. Um, she shows him, or she has him sign the roof of the toy, you know. And they talked for, I think, about an hour. And then at one point, he came out of where he was. And I can't remember if I mentioned this already, but my wife is in a wheelchair. She's had a few strokes and she's got back problems and all sorts of stuff. And so Dan got down on one knee so that he was eye to eye with her in this motorized wheelchair. Um, and he gave her a hug and like a kiss on the cheek and stuff like that. And that just made her day. And then Dan's daughter, Allison, took my wife's phone and she took like 40 or 50 photographs of them just hanging out. So I was happy for my wife. That was like a really huge deal for her. And her birthday is next weekend. So then this was also supposed to be like her birthday present this year was meeting Bumblebee, right? Anyway, so then at one point it looked like Dan was packing up to leave early. So I said something to Flint along the lines of like, "Hey, you know, I'll be right back. I just wanted to touch base with Dan before he took off." And Flint's like, "Is he taking off early?" And I said, "I mean, he looks like he is." And so we went over there and it turns out he was just putting some stuff away. He himself was not going to leave yet. But so I shake his hand and he kind of asks who I am and I said, "Well, you just met my wife." And he's like, "Oh my gosh, Rachel is your wife?" Yeah, first of all, I always think it's interesting when uh they remember the name, right? So I thought that was cool. But it was also cool. He had such a positive tone of voice, right? And then he starts gushing about how nice she is and how, despite the fact that she's had strokes and she's got problems with her back and, all this stuff, he was so impressed that she had this sunny disposition and that she was still so positive. So I said, well, yeah, look who her role model is. And it stopped him dead in his tracks. So I said, you would not believe how much Bumblebee crap she has in the bedroom at home. And he laughed. And then I said, Bumblebee lives in this world with not only guys like Megatron who could just destroy him, right? But there are robots so big and tough they turn into an entire city. For that matter, there's one so big it turns into a planet that eats other planets, right? And in this world, Bumblebee has not really been dealt the best hand. He's the run of the litter compared to all of that other stuff, right? He's an underdog, but he never gives up. And Dan looked overwhelmed by what I had just said. And I don't mean to say that he was overwhelmed. I'm just stating my opinion. That was my read on the moment. He seemed that way. That's, by the way, universal for this whole story. All of this is my take on the moment. So, you know, but he looked like it had never occurred to him that someone who had such a hard life would actually draw inspiration from, like a fictional character, let alone one that he had played, right? Like a certain little yellow bug. And speaking of bugs, I also mentioned Spider-Man and how Peter Parker wasn't exactly known for good luck either. And Dan laughed and agreed. But yeah, he seemed like he was very touched. And then we spent like a lot of time just talking about my wife. She seemed to inspire him with his struggles in life. And so I repeated a quote to him from the show. And I said, no one is really disabled as long as they have courage. And that was interesting too, because as it turns out, Dan has back problems. And it was sort of weird how there were quotes either that he said that I just grew up hearing that stuff since I was a little kid, or it was other people on the show where he was still in the recording booth hearing them speak the words, right? But that at that point in his life, the words maybe didn't resonate with him. But I would hear it as a kid and I would take that stuff to heart. And growing up, a lot of those moments would never leave my head. And so then after 40 years, I was repeating some of these same quotes to him, right? It's going back to the source. But now it's relevant to where he is, where he's at in his life, and it's relevant to me and my wife for where we're at now, and it was this beautifully surreal moment. Um, and then let's see, what else did we talk about? I asked him to settle an old um thing of mine where I said I understand that all the Transformers are millions of years old. Bumblebee's been sleeping for 4 million years when he wakes up in the pilot episode. But I said, I want you to settle something for me. And I asked him, I thought this was cool too. I asked him if he knew what tech specs were, and he did. Um, Tech specs, for any listeners that don't know what it is, when you would buy a Transformer in the 80s, the packaging it came in, if you flipped it over, on the back of it, it basically had a character sheet for that character. And it would give you a bio about, them and their personality and stuff like that. And then it would list like their strength and speed and, everything, intelligence, you name it. So I mentioned to him that on Bumblebee's tech specs, it said something about he looks up to Optimus and Prowl. And Dan nodded and said, that's right. And I said, so my read on that then is that Bumblebee is the kid. And I said, and a lot of people want to argue with me, especially in recent years with there's been different interpretations of Bumblebee. I've had fans tell me they think Bumblebee is supposed to be like Cup, where he's sort of old and wise and he's like older than Optimus Prime. And I said, that's not my take on that at all. And I said, I think he's the youngest one of the Autobots, and that's why he hangs out with Spike, who is the youngest human. And they have that in common, you know. And so Dan nods, and I said, so if anybody knows how old Bumblebee is, I think it's you. Who's right? And he said, with authority, mind you, he was not speculating or he was not saying, well, you got to ask a writer. I thought that was interesting. He had made up in his own mind how old Bumblebee was. And he said he's 22. I said, really? And he goes, you're right. He's the youngest Autobot, but he's a 22-year-old in their equivalent. And I said, okay. And he goes, but he's immature for his age, and sometimes he acts 13. And I laughed and I said, that's funny. And he mentioned this one quote where the human Spike in an episode says, we're going to get out of here. We're going to get out of this situation by the skin of our teeth. And Bumblebee says, I didn't know human teeth had skin. And I don't know, like for whatever reason, that just always stuck with me. I always loved that quote. And he said it to me, and he says it in the Bumblebee voice. And I don't know, that's just is never going to get old in my book, being right there, hearing him say it while he's looking me in the eye, you know. And And I told him, I said, you would be shocked how often I work that into conversation. And he was like, really? And I said, anytime someone uses by the skin of our teeth in a sentence, that is the thing I say back. And he thought that was pretty great. But crap, where was I at? Oh, I'm gonna derail. Um, I don't know. But we were talking about all sorts of stuff. I asked him if he knew what Dungeons and Dragons was. And he did, which was awesome because we've been going to these conventions and we've been meeting various celebrities and we've been asking them to play whatever character that they're famous for in our role-playing game. And nobody up until this point has been an actor who knew what D&D was or what a role-playing game was, right? And so he told me he knew what it was, he knew how to do it, he just never done it before. And I said, well, um, if you're willing, uh, I would love to run a game for you. And he's like, yeah, sure, why not? And so I thought that was really cool. And so there's this like really weird moment where I look him in the eye and I'm like, all right, you're Spider-Man. And he just kind of smiles and nods like, yes, I am, you know. And it's crazy, man, because he's my Spider-Man. He was the first Spider-Man I ever heard on TV. He was my introduction to the character. And it is so messed up to look him in the eye and be like, all right, Spidey. So it's a typical day in New York City. Uh, what do you want to do? And he's like, well, I'm gonna web sling around town and look for some crime. And it's just, oh God, to run the game, but to hear it in the voice was like awesome. Maybe you had to be there. For a lot of people, maybe that doesn't resonate for you or whatever. But for me, dude, that was key. And so I start running him a game, and that's going to be the next video I make, by the way, is what happened in game. This video is the out of game stuff, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. Um, but yeah, so again, in real life, it was Father's Day, and both Dan and Michael had their daughters there with them in their booths. So for sure, the theme of a lot of the games that we played that afternoon, very short games, obviously, very easy games. We kept the dice rolling to a minimum, although we did lose the dice at one point at Dan's booth, which is kind of funny. Um, but the theme was for sure family, and it was fathers and daughters. And so, in the Spider-Man one, for instance, he knew that Spider-Girl is a character that existed. He knew Spider-Girl's name was May, and that she was named after Aunt May. Um, I thought that was awesome. I said something to him about she's married now and she has a kid named Peter. And he's like, "Oh, that's nice." And and I'm like, so do you want to maybe give her husband a hard time or something, because you're the father-in-law or whatever?" And he's like, "Not at all." He's like, "In fact, I think I'm going to take the family out to see the newest Spider-Man movie." And that was cool. And it kind of blew my mind that he's talking about there being Spider-Man movies within the universe where Spider-Man is real. So we're going to have to tackle that in the game. And I'm not against it. I mean, for me, the fact that Spider-Man was the player, right, overrides any objection I could possibly have. But yeah, so we did that. We did a thing with uh oh, and so then Dan is playing, and so then Michael Bell is watching this, so he's figuring out what role-playing games are. Um, and I was telling him stuff too, that like when my kids were little, they did the Wonder Twin thing all the time. So he did it with did the fist bump thing then. That was cool. Um, but yeah, like uh I keep derailing. I'm too excited and I keep derailing. Um, but yeah, we played some. Oh, that's what I was gonna say is they were Cyclops and Colossus in Pride of the X-Men, which was a cartoon in the, I want to say, late 80s. Um, and I think it was supposed to be a series, but they made the pilot, and then I think that they didn't really tell anybody that it existed. And so a lot of people just didn't watch it. And then the network or whatever sees that and thought, "Oh, I guess people don't like X-Men," so they didn't pick it up or whatever for a whole season. But Michael Bell was Cyclops in that, and then Dan Gilvezan was Colossus. And so that was crazy for them to be talking about that stuff. And then they were talking about them having daughters. So we had to invent new characters that for their daughters to be, right? And then we named those characters after the actors' daughters in real life. Um, at any rate, so we did all that. We played. The irony is Flint is a gamer, down to the fact that he was drinking Mountain Dew, which I got a kick out of. Flint is the biggest gamer out of everybody there, and then we never played. Uh, I went back over to Flint's table after the dice got lost at Dan's table. Um, and I mentioned earlier that I knew Flint on Facebook, and anytime I did something in my game that had to do with either Transformers or GI Joe or Inhumanoids or whatever, if it was a thing that Flint worked on, I would usually send him a message on Facebook, just to kind of drop him a line, tell him what I'm doing in case he thought something was like a bad idea or out of character or whatever. And I was always kind of hoping that maybe he would then give me ideas that I could put into the game. I like that interactive thing that these guys make shows and then I make games about the shows. And then, I'm wanting that kind of feedback loop kind of thing, like getting Dan to play Spider-Man, being a fantastic example of that. And so usually though, Flint doesn't really um say anything back. Or if he does, he's just like, "Hey, that's great," you know? And he's got a very easygoing personality. If I had to compare him to anybody from like a movie or something, I'd be tempted to maybe go with like Big Lebowski, where he's so laid back. He reminds me of the Jeff Bridges character in that movie. Um, but at any rate, so when he says that stuff, sometimes I don't know if it's like I'm talking about something he doesn't care about, or if maybe it's more like he just doesn't want to like get in the way of like my creativity, or you know what I mean? Like it's kind of hard to put into words. But so like I kind of like when I tell him what I'm doing with Transformers in my game, like I'm posting it on his Facebook page, and then like if he does say something, I'm like, is he just swamped? Did he have like 100 people comment on a thing? And he's busy with that, and he's not really super aware of what I'm doing in my game, or or is he totally up to speed on it and he's just being really chill, right? So like I never quite know how that is. But so there's this moment where like we're done playing a game and I go over and I sit down next to him again. And he goes, "Hey, so I figured out the next season of Transformers. I figured out what happens." And he just blindsided me with that because to go back a little bit, back in the day, I started this petition on Facebook to ask Hasbro to bring back the original Transformers cartoon. And I just wanted them to pick up and make another season of the show, right? So not a reboot, not any of that, right? Just pick up with the moment that it ended and tell me what happens next. Because ever since I was a kid, I was like addicted to Transformers. And when it ended, I was just like, yeah, but what happens next, right? And so I've just been in that state my entire life. And Flint wrote the movie and he wrote a bunch of episodes. He wrote the first 5 episodes after the movie, which establishes a bunch of the Transformers continuity that we never had before. That was called Five Faces of Darkness. Um, at one point, I came up with a Kickstarter idea, and Flint actually arranged a Skype meeting between me and the brand manager at Hasbro who oversaw the entire Transformers brand. And I pitched this idea to him and I said, "Hey, we'll crowdfund it, right? It'll basically be like a Kickstarter kind of a thing. We will cover the money, right? And all Hasbro has to do is let us make it. It won't cost you anything. We don't even want to make profit on it. So all the profit we're willing to give to Hasbro." And this guy still shot it down. And he said, no, we're not interested in that. We don't like to look backwards. We want to look forward. We're always looking to the future. And so we don't want to rehash our old shows, or, da 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 da. So I mentioned that I've I have a history with Flint of trying to get more Transformers to happen. I've gone above and beyond behind the scenes to try to make that happen, right? And so this has been a long time coming. When Flint turns to me and says, "Oh, hey, by the way, I wrote the next season of Transformers or whatever." And I was like, "Oh my God." And then I'm trying to figure out, so is he just doing it because he wants to do it? Or has somebody paid him to? Is something happening behind the scenes? You know what I mean? Like, whoa, what is the context of this? And I don't know. I don't know what the context of this is. But so like for my whole life, I've been waiting on this answer, right? And so like I kind of like I like mentally it's like I just sort of stalled out for a minute. And it's like I had to reboot and I was like, what happens? You know? And so then imagine my surprise. What he starts describing to me is what I've been doing in my game. It's what I think would happen next. Where it's like, well, I think the war would end, and I think they need to figure out what do we do after the war is over, and so on and so forth. And so he's telling me this kind of like, yeah, this is like the official thing. And I was like shocked. And I said, "You're kidding me." And he's like, "No, why?" And I said, "That's exactly what I'm doing in my game." And he's like, "Oh, that's cool." And then like he just kind of like keeps talking about it, you know? And I was like, "Holy crap." Um, so yeah, I don't know if it's a thing because so many people tell him so much stuff all the time, and he's like really big into the crowdsourcing idea. Like, I don't know if it's kind of like what I've been saying to him is having an effect on him, and maybe somebody is actually he can't announce it yet, but maybe there is some kind of new Transformers thing coming out that's like set in the original continuity. But like, dude, I was so psyched by that. The idea that I might actually have contributed, you know? And like that's part of what I would like to try to find the words for is like growing up, I loved Transformers more than any other franchise. And when I got a little older and when they put out the first DVD for Transformers the movie and they had interviews with people and I was seeing their faces for the first time. And then of course YouTube comes and I'm seeing interviews with everybody at these conventions and stuff like that. And the cast seems so close, like they genuinely like each other and they all get along. And then they talk about the recording sessions and how they're joking with each other and stuff like that, right? And I had this like I had such a strong desire to be a part of that, that I felt like all this stuff I'd spent my whole life loving, watching the show and buying the figures and so on and so forth. It all felt like it was kind of orbiting the core of it, which would was the recording sessions, right? And I wished so hard that I could somehow go back in time and just be in that room and be sitting at that table while Michael Bell is cracking jokes trying to get Peter Cullen to break character while he's Optimus Prime, or then Frank Welker is then cracking jokes trying to get Michael Bell to crack up. It's so on and so forth, right? And it just sounded awesome to me. And yesterday afternoon, I got to sit on the same side of the table with those guys. And Michael Bell was telling jokes trying to get me to crack up, and then I was telling jokes trying to get him to crack up. And for this little period in my life, whether I was or not, right? Because again, this is just my read on the day. I felt like I finally got to sit at the cool kids table. You know what I mean? I finally got to experience that thing that I've wanted to experience for so long. And it was awesome. And then eventually this voice came over the speaker system of the convention hall, and it said, if you're not a vendor, or a celebrity, you got to leave. So that was it. That was the end of the line. So I stood up and I shook Flint's hand and I said, well, dude, this has been awesome, you know. And Flint's like, hey man, I'm gonna be in Ohio next weekend. And I'm like, where are you gonna be? And he's like, Origins down in Columbus on Saturday. You gotta come down, man. And I was like, oh, that sucks. I can't. And he's like, why not? And I was like, I got stuff I gotta do. Like I have, obligations already. Um, my son is going to this camp that is kind of like this vocation thing where they teach people how to do this thing that he's trying to get into. But at any rate, I was like, I got to do that. I got to drop him off at camp, and my wife has an art show. I need to drop her off at her art show. I can't. And he's like, well, that sucks. He's like, well, um, he said he has a cousin. I guess he's from that area, and that's where his family lives. And then he has a cousin whose name is also Flint Dilly. So I assume they're named after a grandpa or great grandpa or something like that. That other Flint Dilly owns a bunch of radio stations in that area. And so at the end of the con, this dude came over and was talking to us, and he's one of the showrunners. And Flint told him, he goes, hey, if you guys have it here next year, again, like this is really good for me because then I get to see family, and my cousin who owns all these radio stations can probably help you out when it comes to advertising the convention and so on and so forth. So it sounds like it's going to be there again next year. And so that was kind of the note we ended on was, I said, hey man, if it's here again next year, I'll be here next year, I'll see you. And I kind of joked with him and I said, and in the meantime, if you want someone to talk to about Bigfoot and the Mothman, I'm your guy. I was like, drop me a line on Facebook, and I'll be happy to do that. And he's like, that sounds good. I will. And I said goodbye to Dan Gilvazan and um, Michael Bell. And I said, I had an awesome time hanging out with you guys today. They said they had a good time, stuff like that. And we walked out to the car and we drove home. And it was a 2.5 hour drive home. And me and my whole family, and like my family had kind of wandered off through the convention. They were just doing their own thing because I was over there talking to those guys the whole time. I never even saw the convention. So, so my son, he was telling me, he's like, Dad, you missed it. There was this guy there from Japan who's a Transformers collector, and he has the 80s Transformers toys, but the ones from Japan that we never even got here in America. And like me and my son are both into the Japanese characters a lot because they're so rare. And I was like, oh my God, did he have anything cool? And he's like, yeah, he had all sorts of stuff that was cool. I'm like, oh, that kind of sucks. I didn't get to see that. But I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade it for the world. And then my daughter, she was getting all sorts of free stuff from people. She was making friends and stuff at the show. She had a bunch of boys following her around. That was kind of weird. Um, but she walked away with a bunch of lanyards and stickers and keychains and stuff like that. And my wife, everybody loved my wife, and they were just giving her no end um of stuff for her birthday. And we walked away with some exclusive Transformers that you could only get them at that one convention. That was pretty neat. They had like a Ravage action figure that's like a in G1 he's a Black Panther guy. So yeah, like that was pretty neat. Um, but yeah, we went home and we're still kind of like basking in the afterglow of yesterday's convention. So, yeah, I wanted to do a video about yesterday to share with you guys what happened because then there's going to be future videos that are a result of this, right? That, for instance, uh, Cyclops and Colossus now have daughters who have the same powers as their dads, so there's going to be some characters introduced into the game as a result of this convention. Um, Stuff like that. There's going to be some characters that are existing characters, but I've never mentioned them in my game before. Um, Michael Bell was the voice of Dick Dastardly. Some listeners will know who Dick Dastardly is, some won't. Um, Recently, there was a movie called Scoob that was kind of an attempt to, I think they were trying to sort of like create the Hanna-Barbera like cinematic universe, basically. And so they wanted to bring in a bunch of these old obscure Hanna-Barbera characters, but at the same time they were kind of tweaking everybody just a little bit to make them a little less like a tune and a little more kind of serious in a way, right? And so with Dick Dastardly, they got about halfway there, I would say, to making him um like seem like a comic book villain instead of a card like a tune. So what we're going to do in our game is have the version that Michael Bell played be more like a comic book villain, right? Um, Make him a little more serious. But yeah, we did a thing that was him and the Speed Buggy characters. That was one of the things. Speed Buggy is another one. I don't even know how we're going to handle Speed Buggy yet. If it's going to be more of like a Knight Rider, artificial intelligence kind of a thing, or what. We didn't really address it. We had Speed Buggy in one of the games yesterday, um, talking and interacting with Michael's character and stuff, but we didn't really say what Speed Buggy was. So, um, on my end, there's a lot I need to figure out now suddenly. Or like the Smurfs. We mentioned the Smurfs because Michael Bell had been a bunch of the Smurfs, and that was something I'd actually been thinking about doing for a long time. Was a more kind of like I'm reimagining the Smurfs through like a Dungeons and Dragons lens, where there's some sort of fey creatures, a more a more serious, grounded kind of take on things. But so this is going to launch a whole bunch of different adventures. And of course, we're going to see Plastic Man and the Wonder Twins and Spider-Man and his amazing friends and Bumblebee and Prowl and all sorts of stuff, right? So there's a lot of stuff coming. Some of that stuff is coming in the next video. Uh some of it is not. But I'm going to wrap it up. This has been a very long video. Um on my end, me and my family had an awesome time yesterday. Uh, we enjoyed it very much. We hope that you guys hearing about our experience was was something that you enjoyed. And as always, if you're willing, we would love it if you helped us out by smashing that like button. Make sure that you're subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe people and not tell them. And then last but not least, leave us a comment. I would love to know if you've met any of these guys before, um, or just, you could share your convention stories, whatever you want to do, right? And from everybody here associated with the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.